Parenting is hard work. All of us sitting here have been the recipient of parental guidance, whether it's the lack of it, or the lack of quality of it, or quality, or maybe it was through someone not biologically related to you. Parents, for good and for bad, have shaped generations since the beginning of time. And if you think about it, the book of Proverbs is one giant parenting book. The phrase "my son" is used 23 times throughout the book. There are 11 references to the individual's mother. There are 15 references to father. There are 5 references to child, and it's not just in one chapter. This is throughout the book. From the beginning of the book, in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8, he says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. For they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck." All the way to the end of the book in Proverbs 31, verse 1, saying the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. Proverbs is a book given to future generations. And parents, whether or not we have children or adult children, our responsibility stays the same, and that is to pass on wisdom to the next generation. Parenting is a huge responsibility. Make sure I already did all this. Okay, I got to remember I have some verses in here. If you have a child, being their parent is a big deal. It is such a big responsibility that that if a pastor cannot parent his children, he is unqualified to lead the church. It has impact. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4 and 5 says this about the pastor, says he must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? For the nation of Israel, parenting was the primary means where children would learn about God. Did you notice the passage that Will Leslie had read earlier? It was the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one," or "the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart." So you get this principal theological statement that Moses makes about God. But then he says in verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise." Parents, your job is to teach and train your children. See, Proverbs was, as we've talked about in many weeks, was a letter to the future leaders of the nation of Israel. And Solomon says this in Proverbs 23, verse 13 through 14, "Do not withhold discipline from a child, for if you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you shall save his soul from Sheol." And without getting too detailed on the parts in the middle, we'll talk about those here in a minute. It says, you will save his soul from Sheol. Parents, discipline your child with the expectation that you will save his soul from Sheol. Now, when you see the word Sheol, generally in the Old Testament, it is talking about, you can think of it like the underworld. It is the place where the dead souls, they go to die, with one day with the expectation that some will go up to heaven and some will go to hell, but it's just this place. You know, when I think of the underworld, what do I think of? Sort of ancient mythology. Was it the Grim Reaper? He's riding on the boat, and then he goes and takes you and then brings you into the underworld. You know what I'm talking about? All scary guy, he wears a hood. That's what I think of, all right? Not quite what the Bible talks about, but that's what goes into my head. But this doesn't really make any sense from that standpoint, because if you think about it, just because you parent your kids well does not mean they're not going to die. Because that means pretty much every one of us is going to be a failure because every one of our kids is going to die. And we're going to die so our parents' failures. So what exactly is he getting from this phrase? And one commentator says this, that death here refers to an eternal severance from the fullness of life that comes from a relationship with the living God. So parents, when you train and discipline your child, you are saving him from a relationship-less existence from God. You are teaching and training and pointing your child to the Lord. And we want to say this because we're going to hit on a few verses here soon. But parents, even in the book of Proverbs, had a huge responsibility. The life of your child depends upon you. The future depends upon you, parents. So there's the story of the 3 little pigs. There were 3 different pigs with 3 different mentalities that built 3 different houses. One pig built his house out of straw, the other built his house out of sticks, and the other built his house out of bricks. Parenting is not really any different. From day one, you are laying in the life of your child bricks or sticks. We all create structures that our family lives in. Emotional, mental, physical. We all create these structures, and they are either made of something that will last or something that will not last. Now, repeatedly in the book of Proverbs uses the word discipline and how it is needed with parenting children. And because of our background, just being how we are in America now, every time we hear of the word discipline, we take it to be very like a negative experience, specifically for the child. For example, if you guys look at Proverbs 13:24, it says this. This is the one quoted all over the place, all right? It's the one we're most familiar with. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Ugh. Okay. You know, that verse has occasionally been taken out of context, and yeah. Proverbs 19:18 says, discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. Once again, pointing death not to killing him, but as in a sort of a avoiding the relationship with God that comes, that fullness of life. It says in Proverbs 22:15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Yeah, okay, that's right. The harder you hit, the farther that discipline runs away. Just don't literally take this one line of my sermon and leave everything else, please, okay? Proverbs 23:13 says, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. But I looked up in the Bible, what was rod? You could kill your child with a rod. See, there was a few things, but a rod could be referred to as a shepherd's stick, shepherd's staff, which is pretty good. Good for hooking sheep and doing what you need to do. A rod could also be pretty much like a wooden club. Yes, that will kill your kid. A rod could also be referred to as a reed, which anybody from down south has had probably the lovely experience of your grandfather or grandmother sending what they call them switches. They should be called death sticks. And they will go and they're really like wavy, and you can just, and pretty much, they're the worst things on the planet. They should be illegal. I'll just say this. I hate those things, okay? So that could also be a reed, okay? Is it right? So you have these different things. So which one's he talking about here? Exactly. Do not withhold discipline from a child. So all these experiences that we've seen, all these verses, they have this sort of negative idea where discipline is a negative experience for the child that is going to change the course of the child and bring him in another direction. Now, this sounds really harsh, especially with how cultured and modern we are in the 21st century. And so I was try to reconcile, some of these together. And I'll say sometimes it's a little hard because you're like, there's probably some more efficient ways than just spanking your child to bring them something good. And I was trying to think through, and as I was praying about it and I was looking at it, there's not a lot. I mean, in the United States of America, people are not under a law, if you want to call it a law of death. There's not really a lot of capital offenses that exist in the United States of America. There's not anymore. And so as a result, we have, I think, shifted away from this need, we've sort of shifted away. And I was looking back and I was trying to do some research on the Old Testament law. And there were 613 laws in the Old Testament. 36 of them were capital offenses that would result in death. And that doesn't even include the other laws that would actually bring financial disparity to the individual, which in that time they did not have a welfare system that would really catch them. You were also condemning your family to death. So when Solomon is saying that discipline could save your child from death, I believe that he was talking spiritual death. But I also believe that he was talking about actual physical death that could happen. And some of these examples would be, so worshiping any other god, necromancy, blasphemy, breaking the Sabbath, and working on the Sabbath for any reason, death. Sexual sins, murder, hitting a parent, negligent homicide, false witnessing. Think about that. Are just some of the examples where you forfeited the life of the individual. There was legitimate fear that went on. If your child violated the Sabbath law, at a certain age, they were forfeiting their life. There needed to be severe lines drawn in the sand, lines drawn by parents toward their kid. You cannot break this because your life is at stake. You cannot violate this under any circumstance or you will die. There is no option. There is no chance of saying, oops, my bad. I'll just hire a good lawyer. No. They took you out of the town or the city you lived in and stoned you. It was over. It required severe, serious discipline to make sure the kids didn't violate some of these. has this negative idea where there is this parents, they had to be very careful in making sure they trained their kids wisely and brought them up because there was life and death at stake. But there is another aspect of discipline that Solomon shares with his son. See, we usually stop. When we talk about negative discipline, we usually stop there and that's all we think of it. But we forget that when Solomon uses discipline, it's not just negative, but it has this idea of training. Because he says in Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So this is an idea of positive, as in teaching and bringing your child up in a certain direction. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 22 says, the iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of sin. He dies for lack of discipline. And because of his great folly, he is led astray. So in this situation, the parent has not trained the child, and there's a lack of discipline. And as a result of that, he is functioning and doing and living foolishly, and there's the risk. He dies. Proverbs 29:17 says, discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. Train your child. In Proverbs 3:11 and 12, it says, my son, and this is talking about the Lord's discipline, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. Now, the question, you're thinking of is, do I believe that the Bible allows for spanking? Yes, I think it's pretty obvious. There is a place that the Bible has left open for what we'd call corporal punishment. But I want to be very, very clear here that if we were only focused on what I'm calling the back end of the parenting process and refuse to actually train and instill good habits in your child, then any form of corporal punishment, or whatever you want to call it, will not be enough to stop your child from living foolishly as they get older. Children require training more than punishment. And so the people who advocate and jump on, well, how dare you tell me I can't spank my kids? I don't think we're saying that. What I'm saying is I think you should spend more time training your child so spanking or corporal punishment is used less and less and less and less. And I say this, and Nikki and I have had, 3 kids. And when we started, what's the quote about parents? Before you have, you think you know everything about parenting before you have a kid. And then you think you have parenting figured out with the first kid, but then the second one comes. And then by the time the third kid, you realize you have no idea what you're talking about, and you're just happy to make it through the day. Parenting's hard work. And so Nikki and I have been constantly adapting and changing our viewpoints, what we think is best, and adjustments. And so, we probably were a little more physical. We leaned harder on that end because, how we're trained. And, you always read a bunch of the verses about, Proverbs and spanking and stuff. And it's often what's quoted. And then as you're doing it, you're like, I don't think this is effective. I think we got to spend more time on being proactive with this and working with it on that end. And so our approaches have been changing and adjusting, and now we're pros. About these 5 minutes, okay? We have it all figured out. Until we get home from church today, then we've lost it again. And so I wanted to sort of give some some examples, and I was trying to summarize some of the things that Nikki and I have that I've been sort of gleaning, from Nikki and from others, and what we've been learning. And one of the big things is, and I want to celebrate this, I am very appreciative of Nikki's background in working with children with autism. She designed and wrote programs for children with autism and trying to help, is helping them become more productive and more, connected to society, a good way to put that. Yeah. So she did a lot. And so she's brought in a lot of tactics and strategies from that. And she's a pretty smart cookie when it comes to that. So I've learned a lot from her. And so as I've learned some of this, and as I've learned some of the other things, I wanted to try to summarize sort of these 5 sort of things that I believe all parents should be trying to think through and adjusting. And I say this, and I want to say this also applies to children's workers, I believe, to grandparents, friends of parents. It applies to everybody, because at some point, someone has asked you, or you've had the opportunity to give positive advice to a parent. Mothers do it all the time with each other. There are like mothering support groups for each other. It's insane. It's really awesome. And so you have great opportunities to do this. So I wanted to just sort of give like 5 things that I was trying to like summarize my experience with it and what I've gleaned from Nikki and then everything else. So these are it. This is this is the need for structure. All right, so here we are. Okay, the first thing that I believe you need to think through is, I believe you have to be, as a parent, and I touched on this a little bit here a minute ago, I believe parenting is proactive. Now, I understand that there's only so much you can think ahead in regards to your kids, okay? But I believe that training comes through proactive choices and providing structure and teaching and guiding your child. I have heard it said from parents, well, my kid's about 2 now. I think I can start telling him or her no. I'm like, may God have mercy on your soul. Wow. You have wasted 2 years. What have you done for 2 years? You haven't even, I don't even know where to go with that. Like, are you providing structure for your child? For example, your kid starts getting up and crawling, and there's these tiny holes about their eye level. They love to stick things in there, right? So parents try to be proactive. They plug them up, so they don't even give the option until you go over to a grandparent's house. Well, your grandparent hasn't baby-proofed. Grandparent doesn't even know what that is anymore. They go, whatever, I don't even care. And so your child goes, and your cute little Vera happens to have a key of yours. And our house is baby-proofed, and goes right over. And I've seen my dad open doors this way. What mysterious door is behind this wall? They'll go right in. No. That's what happens in slow motion. And so you're like, oops, I wasn't proactive. I forgot that this is even a thing in other houses. And so then you begin to teach, and you begin to have the child recognize this is no, you don't want to touch this. And you make them say it, and you're proactive, and they realize, I don't know what this is, but it is a no. And dad gets up, and he's like trying to dive off the couch. I think that's a little funny, but he seems to be serious about this. So your goal is to be proactive, and you teach your child not to fry his brains out in the wall. Requires proactive. And this can be extended to anybody and everything of any age. You're trying to teach good behavior. My dad would spend time teaching, making sure I said yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, and no ma'am. Drove me nuts, because I didn't think some people deserved a sir or a ma'am. Okay, but he taught me anybody older than me, yes, sir, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And I don't do that with my kids, but for me, it taught me a lot about this idea of respect that was there. And so that's what my dad is, because he's trying to be proactive and teaching me this idea of respect. And so that's how my dad tried to be proactive in training there. We all have our things, but we must, as parents, be proactive. We can't just fly by the seat of our pants, because that's not going to work. I also think that the punishment should be logical. And this is specifically speaking against this idea of corporal punishment or physical harm on the kids. There is a book titled How to Train a Child. No. How to Train Up a Child. Thank you. Wow, I just knew this here a few minutes ago by Pearl, by Dave Pearl? Pearl. Last name Pearl. Okay, don't ever read it. I'm serious. Because, and this is where if you're like, oh, now I'm going to read it because Pastor told me not to. I know how this works, okay? What it does is, and this is where it takes a legalistic approach to parenting and intertwines it with biblical verses. And I will tell you, like, children have died as a result of the book. Taking fire hoses to your child outside because they need to learn corporal punishment. And I will tell you straight up, this is a quote from it, okay? I want you to think about it. The cane, not the corner. Oh, it's Michael and Debbie. I actually put it here, Michael and Debbie Pearl. So he says, one young boy is not spanked when he throws a tantrum or disobeys. It seems that he delights in doing what he is commanded not to do. The more he rebels, the meaner and guiltier he gets. For punishment, he is pinched or made to sit in the corner, or sometimes put in a dark closet. When he comes out, he is madder than ever. He could intimidate a fire-eating dragon. Sitting in the corner, he was heard to say, nobody likes me. I'm as bad as the devil. I never do anything right. This little fellow is being reared to take his place in a jail cell. Dark corners and dark closets breed darkness in the soul. An empty room and a pouting child incubates guilt and anger. Only the rod and reproof bring correction. Somehow children know the rod is just their due. So I bring this up because you hear about this book. How many of you guys have ever sent your kids to their room because they just need a timeout? Come on, parents. How dare you? Sure, you can do that. You are teaching your child how to live in a jail. Where in the Bible do we have any proof that being sent to timeout is breeding darkness in the soul? We don't. Let me tell you, our souls are already pretty dark. We're sinners in need of a Savior. At the moment your kid is born, there's darkness there. It's there. So this idea that unless you beat your child and spank him, they're not learning, it doesn't really fit. So for example, has your child, think about it in the history of your child, if your child is, you know when your children get naughty and you just know they're wanting attention? It's like hard to describe, but they're just getting your attention. They're just trying to get your attention, and you're not paying attention to them, and so they keep doing stuff so they get your attention. All spanking them does is give them attention. They've won. They've got what they wanted. I just wanted your attention. And so there are times where the crime, the guilty party just needs to go away for a bit. the best punishment you can do, the logical punishment for craving attention is not giving attention. See, our punishments need to fit, because in society, when let me think of any number of things. Let's say you overspend your budget, okay? And you had to use your credit card. I mean, technically you'd say, it's probably not the best thing, but you had to, okay, whatever. But you do that. Has anybody gotten physically punished from that? Has anybody gotten a spanking? Has anybody gotten a spanking for stealing? Has anybody gotten a spanking for talking naughty? It doesn't fit. So I think as parents, there needs to be a logical connection with the crime. And I believe you do speak it. Now, I will say, as any parent, there are times where that logical punishment, your child just doesn't care, and you're like, okay, we're taking this up a notch. I get it. But I do think, oftentimes, if our punishment fit the crime, I think it would actually instill some behavior they'd see cause and effect a whole lot quicker than, you're naughty. Here's a really silly example. I don't encourage it, okay? But my mom, I had a problem with my mouth. Go figure. Quick-witted, man, I was very gifted at tearing people down. I could as quick as I could. And that's what I did. And every time I did, my mom would say, go wash your mouth out with soap. I didn't eat it. I've heard some kids eat it and they get sick and your mom's so abusive. Oh, give me a break. I would go over and I lick the bar of soap. That was gross. But to my mom, that was a logical way of connecting my tongue with the punishment. Now, please don't run out here and everybody make your kid wash their mouth out with soap. I'm just trying to use an illustration here of what my parents tried to connect, okay? But I think that's how it goes. I think there's, if your child can keep their mouth closed because they're talking disrespectful, maybe literally have them just keep quiet. And until they can stay quiet for 20 minutes, they're not going to get whatever. And so they learn, I should probably keep my mouth closed. Yeah, you probably should. So there's logical ways to connect the crime. So the punishment should fit the crime. All right, so that's what I've tried to, and one of those is attention. All right, another one I thought was really important is this idea of consistency. And so what I believe that consistency teaches some very important things, and one of those is that actions have consequences. So I created some circles here, okay? So there are some families that dad is the stricter one. Okay? This can be reversed. Sometimes mom are stricter, okay? But so sometimes dad is strict and mom is not as strict. Or sometimes it's switched. All right, and the kid's there and trying to figure out, okay, if I break dad's rules, I get in trouble, but I don't get in trouble by mom, I get in trouble by dad, or switch it around. This can really be a problem in homes that have had a divorce in them, because, dad acts one way, or one family acts one way, the other family acts the other way, and so the poor child is trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong. And so it can get really confusing for a child, it's okay here, it's not okay here. And what ends up happening is, I think later in life, the kid then has a choice to actually find which right or wrong they want to follow. And I believe it sets children up, if there's not consistency in the home, where they're the Bible just seems a little too restrictive. So I'm going to choose this one. And it sort of creates it creates there. And I'm not saying that, if a child is like this, they're going to go. I'm just saying this is where you can have these issues, all right? Now, so the goal is, when the kid breaks the rules, they get in trouble. See, the dad inadvertently is teaching right is inside the circle. When you step outside the rules, you're getting in trouble and you've broken the rules, all right? But my mom says this is okay. So to the mom, this isn't sin, but to the dad, it is. Now what? Create some confusion there. So the goal is to do the best of your ability, have dad's rules and mom's rules match to create consistency. For parents, this is a lot of work because I'll change my mind and I forgot to tell Nikki, or Nikki has changed her mind and forgot to tell me, or she tells me and I forgot to listen. And so, you're just there. And so you have this, and so then we're like, how are we taking care of this? And Nikki's like, well, I have found like this and this and this works. Oh, okay. We're trying to maintain a level of consistency. So our children know you violate the sin, you get in trouble, and we maintain this. And so it allows us to teach there. Okay, so that's one of the other ones. I think we have to be consistent with our rule set because it begins to teach them that you break the standard, there's consequences. Good, and I think for Christian parents, it's easy to then use that as a way to highlight the fact that you break God's standard, there are natural consequences to your actions. You can begin to teach truths of heaven and hell, and from there begin to teach the standard of grace. The next one here I think we need to think of is I think we have to be mindful of each of our children or each of the children in our place. So I quoted earlier the phrase about, after you have your first kid, you think you have it figured out, and then you have a second child, and you're like, whoa. And it's because each child is different. What works for one child doesn't necessarily work for the second child. And then you think you have it figured out with two kids, and then you have a third one. And you're like, what works for the first kid doesn't work with the second kid or the third kid. What works for the third kid doesn't work for the second kid or the first kid. What works here works for the second and the third, but it doesn't work with the first. So it's a lot of work, parents. I'll admit it. It's a lot of work, but we must be mindful that sometimes our kids don't respond like they do others, and we just go to adjust and adapt and try to do our best. No one's perfect. And lastly, I think it's this idea that our parenting needs to be theological. I think it needs to be biblical. I think it needs to be religious. I think we need to use our parenting as a platform that we can begin to teach the grace of Jesus Christ and the gospel in their lives. Galatians 3:24 says this. It says, and this is Paul talking about the Old Testament law, but I believe it applies to our parenting. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. Our law at home hopefully has the objective to produce wise, productive citizens of society that produces a good child. A lot of our rules and standards has that goal. Where do you want them to be? That we teach them citizenship and history and a variety of things like that. But it also has another aspect that our law serves as a guardian for the child until they become old enough to begin to understand their need of a Savior and the fact that they are guilty of breaking God's law. And there are consequences for that. And so that are what our rule system does. It sets up a protection. So we're teaching our kids that if you violate this, there are consequences. And your life, child, your spiritual life is at risk if you don't turn to Jesus. That's what parenting is. We are handing the gospel off to our children. And we do this through our system of rules and through that is what we are teaching our kids at a basic subconscious level. And one of the ways this is demonstrated, I think, is Nikki and I try and tell our children to make good choices. We never tell them to, in quote, be good, because our kids aren't naturally good. They can learn to make good choices but it doesn't mean they are good inside. That is a work of Jesus Christ in their life. And that is something that we as parents need to keep instilling into our children. Now, does that mean I tell my child you are worthless and terrible? No. Because the value, our value to our Heavenly Father is eternal, so much so that He sent His Son to come and to die for us. We must build up the value of our child. But our parenting does not save our kids. That's Jesus. The law serves, our rules serve as a guardian for our kids. And we pray and we keep teaching them grace and we keep teaching them Jesus with the idea that one day they too will see it and they'll be like, I can't do this without Jesus. And they believe in faith. So that's parenting in a nutshell. I've probably gotten everybody mad at me. If I did, remember last week, don't be